Well, hello and welcome to the Bill of Rights Institute's 10th period webinar series. My name is Kirk Higgins. I'm the Senior Manager for Education at the Bill of Rights Institute.
And I'm Humphreys, Director of Outreach at the Bill of Rights Institute.
And this week, we are fortunate enough to be joined by two guests. Tracey Downey, who has been an educator for 15 years and has been involved with the Bill of Rights Institute for over 9 years now. She teaches AP and Honors U.S. History in Florida. So welcome, Tracey.
Thank you.
And we are also joined by Craig Bruce Smith, who is an assistant professor of military history at the School of Advanced Military Studies at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He's also the author of American Honor, the Creation of the Nation's Ideals During the Revolutionary Era, and the co-author of George Washington's Lessons in Ethical Leadership. And Smith earned his PhD in American History from Brandeis University. So welcome, Dr. Smith. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Great. So today our topic is history. So nice and broad, but really it's talking about history in tumultuous times. And I could probably posit that times are always a little bit tumultuous. And so it's really thinking about how it is that we teach U.S. history in a pluralistic society or a plural society like the U.S. has. And so before diving into what any of that means, I'd like to kick off with just a little bell ringer. And I thought it would be interesting for us all to think about a historical event that we were all a part of in some way or all witnessed in common. And so the one that stands out for me, at least for our generation, is September 11th, the September 11th terrorist attack. So I thought if we could just all quickly mention sort of where we were and what we were doing on the day of 9/11, just to kind of get a sense for how we all experience this differently.
Absolutely. So before we get started, though, I'd love to mention that we do have, we want this to be a relationship with you, our viewers. So we have Twitter, Facebook, and the chat box here on YouTube. If you want to comment or ask questions, we'll be monitoring all of those platforms. So please let us know your questions. Let us know how you're reacting to what we're doing here today. So what was I doing on September 11th? I was teaching at a primary school, at a daycare in New Jersey, about 40 minutes from New York City, and 90% of our parents worked in the city. So the morning of the attacks, I had gotten to work nice and early to get the kids when they're dropped off at about 7:30, 8 o'clock. And as the attacks were happening, we started hearing about it from parents who were coming in because we weren't monitoring because it was days before the internet. And over the course of the morning, we turned on the radio and a TV in a break room and we're trying to monitor the situation, but we had all these children and it was a very scary moment. We couldn't get in touch with parents. We had to shut down the school because the fear about the potential for bioterrorist attacks was that everybody should go home and like barricade your doors, put wet towels. Nobody knew what was going on. But we couldn't get in touch with any parents because all the cell towers were down. And so we had to call secondary parents. It was a very stressful day. And then I went that afternoon to Washington Rock Park, which overlooks the city, to see the devastation. And that was my day.
How about you, Tracy?
So I have a different perspective, which is crazy to me to listen to other people's stories. I was attending college. I was in my last year, and I was actually pulling into the parking lot when I got a phone call that said, hey, the World Trade Center has been hit. And my first instinct was to say, are you serious? Like, how could a prop plane hit that? Like, how could you miss it? Because a few years prior, a prop plane had hit it, and I didn't think anything of it. My whole family lives in New York. My aunts and uncles worked in the tower, and it progressed from that moment. But I will never forget being at UCF and hearing the air sirens go like a war. Like if you're on a golf course and the siren goes off to get off the course, they actually used that, and they told all residents to go to the dorms, and all students that were not residents needed to leave. So I remember walking away that morning thinking, well, where do we do? Where do we go? What's supposed to happen? And I was supposed to work at Disney that afternoon, and they actually called that day and said, don't report to work. We're closing the park, which at that moment I knew this is really big, bigger than I thought, because Disney doesn't close. So.
Yeah. Wow. That's interesting. And Dr. Smith, how about you?
I was in New York City. It was my first day of college. I was walking to my first, what would have been my first class of undergrad. And the experience was, didn't know anything about it, walked to class, and then someone told me class had been canceled. And they said, well, something happened at the trade center, and didn't know what. And then the first report was a plane had hit it. And again, the first reaction was very much, well, this was accidental. I mean, I'm from New York, so I'd been there for the 93 attack, and it was, things filtered out slowly. My mom worked in the area, and it was very much a surreal moment. Again, also just the not knowing what was going on, and also being so geographically close and having family, you know, in the area. So that's my memory.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was in school as well, taking a standardized test. So they had blocked out all information from us. And I didn't know until after the end of the test, they announced everything that had happened from the 2 planes in the World Trade Center to the Pentagon. So I got it sort of all at once. And again, had that same experience of not knowing what was going on. And then I grew up in Indiana. And so there's Grissom Air Force Base was just north of where I was. And so we had the experience of planes flying over to go support Air Force One. And so you hear the sonic boom and you're just very confused. Well, thank you all for sharing those stories. I think it's interesting on a couple levels, and I think this is a good activity you can do with students, particularly if you're doing it about an event that happens in your local community. It doesn't always have to be something large like 9/11, but getting different perspectives.
Most students now weren't born then.
That's right. Yeah, which is an amazing thing. But yeah,
this was my last year of having students who were alive. When I said how many of you are alive, nobody raised their hand. It was the first year I thought, okay, so it's your Pearl Harbor now. Like,
yeah. So I think it's interesting from a couple of perspectives, both of which, you know, it shows the personal side that some of these stories can have. So how personal the history stories can be to different communities or groups of people, but also how your perspective can change based on where you were. And then the story itself can change, how things unfolded. We all talked about a lot of the unknowns. So I think that's also a good way to show students that, look, the historical actors who were taking part in these events didn't know what was unfolding. It's very easy to have hindsight and say, well, of course, this is how things played out, but that's not necessarily the case, right? So anyway, thank you all for participating in that little bell ringer activity. I just wanted to kind of get us thinking about it. But I thought I'd start the conversation, Dr. Smith, by just asking you a question, which is, what really is the craft of history? What is it we're doing? So we get these stories with all these different perspectives. How is it that we're expected to pull together a single story at all? And are there dangers that are associated with that?
Okay, and that's a great question. Let me preface that by saying my standard disclaimer based on where I'm employed. My views are all my own, do not reflect those of the U.S. government, U.S. Army, Department of Defense, or anyone else aside from me. So now that being said, I can say what I think. So history, you know, standard definition, I mean, we're not to belabor the point, history is anything that's happened in the past. And oftentimes for students, it's portrayed as this sort of big amorphous thing that just happens. And there's no sense of individual action here, or thought or influence. The issue with history is, from the beginning, it has been shaped, reshaped, interpreted, reinterpreted in a number of different ways from multiple different perspectives. And it can be virtually anything to anyone. The inherent goal of history, at least in the modern sense, and sort of as a discipline, should be to maintain some level of objectivity. It's really difficult to do because everyone has their own viewpoint, their own biases, and there's no such thing as a completely objective history. But the goal should always be to analyze the events based on how the people at the time viewed them. And I think that's where the greatest danger is in the study of history right now, is to have modern people, whether they're historians, whether they're the general public, whoever, try to impose modern viewpoints on people in the past, or to interpret how people acted in the past based on modern understandings. I think that's the greatest challenge. It's, if you want to call it a danger, but I would say it's the greatest challenge and the greatest obstacle to anyone who's studying history at this moment, or any moment, I should say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's interesting too, because the inherent challenge of not doing that is also getting students to relate, right, Tracy? So, you have these, high school aged kids that are in the classroom, and you want them to be interested and engaged. And it's tough to get them into the mindset of, say, an 18th century revolutionary figure, right? But what are ways that you find that you pull those different perspectives in, or you try to get the students to shed some of their modern lens, and look at it more from the perspective of those who participated in it?
So in my classroom, one of the big things that we do the very first day of school is I try to go from the angle of saying everything you're about to learn, because you have to take that poll. How many of you like history? The vast majority will say no. And you say, okay, here's why. You've been taught through the books, and there's really, really normal people that go through history, just like you and me. And those people have the same view. So if you get mad at something, they got mad at something. But instead of teaching through a textbook, I really love primary documents. And I love pulling the drama ones. Like, I love pulling something and saying, here's the good side of it, but before you have an opinion, here's the bad side of it. And then letting these kids argue it out. Exactly like he said, was they see everything from 2019 or through Instagram. So if you can make them step away and say, look, we're studying the 1800s, or we're studying this, we need to think how they thought. That's a really big challenge. But I think once the kids get that, and you remind them constantly, these are viewpoints of this time period, they start to see history unfold as a narrative and actually as a story, as opposed to, well, so-and-so told me this, and this is what it is.
No, I think, Tracy, I think you're absolutely right. And that's a similar sort of thing I've even done at the college level with the who hates history. And then the students are, I don't know if he's joking or
right.
what.
Do I raise it?
But I think primary sources is at any level is the way in. And what you said about presenting the different sides is crucial, because when you're only presenting one side, or whatever the views are of that textbook author or authors, you're inherently shaping what history is, more specifically, is what it is not.
And I was trying to tell the kids too, I say, if I show you a successful person, there's somebody who failed because of that person. So if I show you the failure, somebody succeeded. So you have to look at it from both perspectives. I mean, I know, so in Florida, we open with the Reconstruction era, which is very hard to start with if they don't have the background for Civil War. Like, why did we even get here? Why do they hate them? And the very first day you walk in and you start talking about it. And of course, as soon as we bring slavery into it, they're like, well, that's racist. That's where it started. And you're like, no, hold on. There's a background to this. And that's normal, and you have to go through a different thing. So I think it's really fun to let them read a slave narrative. That sounds awful to say fun, but you know what I mean? To read the documents that prove points. And then they kind of say, well, I never knew that, or I didn't know they thought that. So it kind of sees it as, it's also more human. If I give you a random person to read about and I say, here, John said this. They don't know who John is, but they sure know who, George Washington is. Let's give him somebody off the beaten path to hear the normal views.
But it's also important that they learn to evaluate sources. As much as we hear it in the news about what is accurate reporting or fake news or et cetera, students need to be taught to read critically and to assess what's being said. How does it hold up? Is there a motivating factor? Is this something written for public consumption? Is it in a journal? Is one more honest than the other? Maybe they're not. Maybe they are. But I think that's all things the student has to grapple with. And that's something that as educators, we should be really trying to pull out of our students.
And I think what you're both speaking to is that in order for us to grow societally and as human beings, we have to put ourselves in touch with diverse perspectives in a way that allows us to see the common humanity among us, right? So the reason that it's so powerful to look at the primary source is when you read the letter from Mary Garvey, which was the Irish immigrant girl who wrote back to her family in the 1800s, you see yourself as a 15-year-old in the letter from Mary Garvey. Or when you read the petition of Belinda Sutton to the state of Massachusetts, you see yourself as someone, you see the appeals to something common in our experience as human beings. And that, instead of distancing you from the experience, draws you in to that person in that moment in a profound way. And so I was wondering if we could kind of talk about how you balance the importance of diversity and pluralism with that common experience of the common human experience.
That is one of the big things that everyone's tackling and has been for quite some time, but certainly in more recent memory. The historical field up to, let's say, 50 years ago had been decidedly looking at only a certain group of people, largely white, elite, male, and that's started to change. But that's not even just saying racially or based on gender or economics. It's also what avenue, what aspect, what's the national background, or what's the context. As much as you could do is preferable. Again, there's confines based on the nature of how long a course is or how long a book is, but the idea being you should try to present diverse sides. And this is sort of something that's going on more broadly in academia, that there are certain trends or certain ideas or topics that are trendy, therefore they get more attention than others. And there may be a tendency to move away from what's over here for what's over here because this is what's trendy. But I think you need to have all sides of it in order to have a proper evaluation. Now, you don't have to agree with one side or the other. But I think both sides have to be presented in some way. Now, is there a common history? That's hard to say. And many people will say, no, there's not. It's individual experience. Some people will say, well, is there a common national story? And just as many people will say, no, there is not. It all depended who you are. But I do think you could study both, but there are themes you could pull out. And I believe things like ethics and morality are key components throughout history. And they may be things that are completely different, but at some point, regardless of where you go, where you are, there was a belief of what was right, what was wrong. There may be lots of gray, but there is some sense of what that is. And I think that's something that where you can find a commonality across time, space. So that's one way in. Again, obviously, like today, one person's definition of what is good versus what is bad is going to vary greatly. But I think that's what's so interesting.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Dr. Smith, and I know that you touched on this in your book. I mean, just the idea that, and this I think is where it's hard too for students to grapple with sometimes, but the sort of that framework, that moral framework that individuals are working with at these different times can be radically different. Particularly, I mean, the 18th century, the 19th century in particular, leading up to the Civil War, was a very religious age, right? So viewing things through that religious lens doesn't mean imposing religious views on the students that are learning it, but understanding that that's the perspective where it may be coming from, I think is an important thing for understanding how decisions are being made or not being made. And so, I think that's interesting. I also really like that both of you talked about these dividing points. And I wondered, and Tracy, maybe you have an example of, and you mentioned Reconstruction, but I always like, and one thing we try to do here at the Bill of Rights Institute is set up historical arguments so that they're actually butting against each other, letting these historical actors speak to one another. Particularly ones that surprise people. So I tell people in the office all the time, we are the Bill of Rights Institute, of course. But I always say that my favorite Federalist paper, because everyone should have a favorite Federalist paper, is Federalist 84, because it's Hamilton's argument against the Bill of Rights. And yeah, and it's like, hey, I mean, because it's interesting, right? In making students grapple with these things, to say, look, just because things played out the way they played out isn't always the way that it was going to happen, right? It takes individual action. It takes thought. It takes courage. It takes a lot of these sort of internal civic virtues for people to get these things out. And so I didn't know if you guys had a favorite sort of tense moment in U.S. history that you'd like to highlight, and also just remind everyone to send us any questions that you have to our Twitter at BR Institute, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Bill of Rights Institute, or right there in the chat box on YouTube Live.
To answer that, I mean, there are so many you could choose from. So I try to pick one. In my opinion, it's arguably the most important moment in U.S. history. Again, arguable. You could. I wrote about this recently in an op-ed for the Washington Post, and I believe the most important moment, or at least up there, is George Washington surrendering his commission after the American Revolution to Congress. I believe that is on par with the 4th of July or any other event anyone cares to bring up, because it maintained civilian supremacy. The idea that the military upheld civilian authority, answered to the people. It was not a revolution that descended into tyranny or dictatorship or a warlord, or however you want to look at it. And this became the basis for the nation. And it's something that took such personal belief in the goals of the nation. And it's something that's maintained itself ever since. And I think that, to me, is the truest depiction of sort of the idea of American liberty, American devotion to the will of the people.
I think that's great. It's also one of the 4 paintings, I think, recognized in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol building, which is always a fun thing to point out.
That's why I put on my book cover.
Oh yeah, that's terrific. That's terrific. So Tracy, how about you?
Well, today we actually did Washington's farewell address, and we were talking about it, and it was interesting because the kids who, I teach 11th graders, and they said, well, isn't this a really big moment in history? And I said, well, why do you say that? Like, what is your opinion on that? And they said, well, for someone who was held in such high regard to say, thank you, this has been fun, and I'm going to go back now, and I'd like to retire if it's okay with you. They said, why is he even asking? Why didn't he just stay on? And I said, well, what would have happened if he stayed on? So the what if conversation became bigger than the lesson, which was to read it and understand it. But then, of course, that turned into, well, I don't understand it. Don't we see now what he was telling us? Like, why are we not going back to what he said a lot? And I said, because what he said to some people is irrelevant now. The kid, you would have thought I said something awful. The kids were like, what's George Washington? He's not irrelevant. And I said that, So it's like moments like that where they can link it or they see it for me when I say, okay, they're getting it and they understand that it's repeating itself and we need to watch certain things and do certain things. We don't go back as far as like content. The majority of my kids are honors and they started the Civil War. So a huge turning point for them this year has been, why did we start the Civil War? Was it worth it? Or could we have just waited? So I find for me that the what if conversations are huge, and it leads it to a lot bigger conversations, like you said, where, of issues today. They all want to talk about current events. They all want to know more, and they all base it on what they've been told or what they know. I always tell my kids, my parents told me what we believed in when I was a kid. This is what you are. This is what we believe. Okay, mom and dad. And then I grew up, and then I went to college, and I was like, I have a few questions, because I didn't know. So when the kids come in, they're like, this is what I am. Okay, why? Because my dad told me. So you have to kind of break those moments. And I think when we talk about defining moments, they see things happening today that are more, I don't know the word to say, it's like so large to them that these to them are their defining moments. So I love that you went back and said something so long ago.
No, but I think the farewell address is another great moment, and something you mentioned about that George Washington is no longer relevant is something that's very problematic and deeply troubling, I think, because this is not a logic that's necessarily coming from just, a random person. You do have large sections of the historical community even pushing back on this, that you need to study other individuals or to focus solely on the personal flaws of individuals, which therefore would undo anything else they'd accomplished in their life. And I think that's problematic. And I think students often have a great interest in sort of leading figures because they're interesting, because they had such opportunity and did shape the nation and the world in so many ways. And to move away from that, I don't want to say forget the lessons of the past, because history doesn't repeat itself, but it's there are similarities. But
yeah.
When you have, particularly in the founding era, ideas that are believed, that are put into action and are used still today as the foundations of government, I think that's really, to dismiss that is to put yourself at risk at your own peril here.
Well, and for me, I often wonder, so when I ask the kids, is this relevant today? Is this, if they can see that it is, or they can connect it, then I think that we're doing justice for what we're supposed to be doing. I do agree with you. There are and have been in the past where kids have said, this is so long ago, it doesn't apply. But then you say, well, let's look at the Bill of Rights. Let's look at this. I had just told somebody, I made them write the Bill of Rights again in modern times. I said, get rid of what we don't need. Nobody wanted to get rid of anything. The only one they said we should get rid of is the Quartering Act. Like, I don't want anyone living with me that I don't know. But for the most part, they understood once they learned about it, the value, and in time period, this was important. So, I think that I agree with you 100%. We have to make sure that everyone knows that. And if we base things on flaws, we're all going down. Like, none of us are going to make it. So.
Well, I think that leads really well into a comment and question that we got from Steve on YouTube. He said, how do you deal with the relevance of the framers' intentions? Since we live in such a different world, how do we decide how much weight to give their views? That's a great question. So, Craig, Tracy, what do you think?
That is a great question. One we will not be able to answer, and I will artfully dodge in certain ways. So this is the major issue legally, politically, socially, economic, whatever ism, or this is at the heart of it. So what weight do you give original intent versus adaptation? Did the founders know there would be nuclear weapons when they wrote a certain amendment? No, they did not. Did they foresee certain social changes? Of course not. So this is, it's important to see both sides of this. And I think that's what the takeaway should be. So if we go back to the Constitutional Convention, there is not a universal agreement. So present the Federalist, the anti-Federalist argument, and look at how this was never a one unified idea. It's something that was born of compromise and adjustments, but it was never something where someone could say, this is the word. It was mutually constructed. Yes, some people have more of a hand in it than others. The thing is, too, the founders and the framers understood they were creating a living document. They put in the ability to make amendments so that it could be amended. If they did not intend this to be, etched in stone, they wouldn't have added the amendments. Now, we could argue about, how was this put in and the political maneuvering, but at the fact the amendment process exists means our current leaders have the ability to alter the document based on how they feel is in the best interest of the nation, what best reflects the best interests of the American people. And it can be done. Now, you have to look at, there's a different mindset when the Constitution is created. This is a United States that's just gotten out of a war against a tyrannical king. Their greatest fear is a return of a domestic monarch or a tyrant. So they're coming from a very different time period. So some of the concerns they had in the 1780s are certainly going to be different than the concerns we have in 2019. So I think it's important to look at both sides and to evaluate. I mean, some of it is language issues, but evaluate what is applicable, what is at the heart of the matter. And it was always meant to be a document that had, well, I should say it always has been interpreted, and I believe it always will be interpreted. And that's what makes the US Constitution probably the greatest document ever created.
Yeah, and if I could put maybe a spin on Steve's question, because I think the way that sometimes we think about approaching this is what are the big questions that they're trying to answer, right? Like what is it about the Constitution, not necessarily the policy specifics that they're dealing with, but what are the big questions about representation? What are the big questions about the size of government? What are the big questions that they're wrestling with in order to try to unify? And it makes me think of, I mean, obviously there's similar questions in society today that spills over. So I wonder, Tracy, if I could if I can spin Steve's question a little bit here, just to ask you, he's talking about sort of intentions, and I guess, what are, I guess we kind of already talked about this a little bit, but finding good hooks. I mean, I see a lot of props on the wall behind you that I'm sure you get pulled into your classrooms all the time, but good hooks for getting students to think sort of broadly about, historically thinking, really getting into what history is, which it's, and we talked about what it is. I think it might be fun to talk about what history isn't. But one thing that I don't know that it is just a memorization of names, dates, facts, and places, because that's A, not very much fun, and B, not that complicated, because things happen and we can dispute those things. But maybe how is it that you get students to really start thinking historically, thinking bigger, getting them to really sink their teeth into what these arguments are really about, not just what the outcome was?
That's my first day lecture. History isn't names and dates.
Hey, there you go.
For me personally, this is just me, and I don't know what other people do, but I really have developed, I guess, to say my room is a living timeline, and it starts, the very first thing on the wall is a 1492. No, that's way too early. I wasn't alive. It's from the French and Indian War. It's a newspaper, and it goes all the way down. And anytime I find a document or an item or something that the kids would get to touch or see, I get it, or it's donated, and I bring it back to the classroom. And you would be amazed how much the kids want to get involved when they can see and touch things from history. The joke when we set up was, oh, look, I picked the perfect spot because I'm sitting in front of the flag, but the kids love that this is a 48-star flag. Like, so though I don't have a lot of constitutional stuff, obviously, but I have the documents, I have the Federalist Papers. The kids want to know that they were alive. Like when we did the 9/11 story, we all had memories because we were alive. We could touch it, we could see it, we could remember it, we feel it. If we don't connect to them, then no one's ever going to like history. There has to be more to it than a date, a time. And of course, there's dates they need to remember. But as far as getting them hooked, they have to know that, one, that you as a teacher have passion for it. And then two, they have to know that they're a part of it somehow. So the very first day they come in and I say, find your birthday on the timeline. So the entire room all the way around has items, and they all go stand in one little corner. And I say, okay, so this is when you were born. And then I'll scoot back just a little bit because I'm really young. I'll scoot back just a little bit to the 70s. And I'm like, this is where I was born. And they all make fun of me and being old. And I said, but I need you to understand everything around the room that had to happen before you even were thought about. That's how big our world is. And when we think in today's Snapchat or Instagram, like you all live here, and we have to think outside the box. We have to understand that history is far more than that. And that the people that started all this had no idea who you were or I was, and they thought about you.
Yeah. And Tracy, I love the stories that you've told us of that your students then go on to contribute to your timeline. They're out at estate sales or they're out traveling and they'll bring you little trinkets back, right?
Yeah, and they're all over the place. The room is a little chaotic, but they love it. So, I mean, I have a 1970s, I just had a student bring me a TV guide from the 1970s. He's like, who's JR? Why is this a big deal? I was like, what? How do you not know who JR is? But it was a big deal. So I now have it on the wall and the kids like, can I look through it? What was on them?
So if someone ever brings you an original copy of the Declaration, you could retire early.
I will. I
Right.
will, and I'll probably laminate that too.
But
Oh.
I think the point's great about the idea of trying to place students within sort of a timeline. The idea that all of the past was not building up to this moment. We are but a small part of what has happened and what is to come. And that's an important lesson to keep in mind for any modern audience, regardless of their age.
And the problem, especially for young people, is that they have no real perspective, right? So their only perspective is their own experience. They're often very inward facing, just due to the nature of the adolescent being one that is very socially bound by their own social environment. And so what I hear you discussing is how, by situating them within a historical context, you have them look out in this really interesting way. What is your experience of how that looking out, how that exploration of different historical moments helps them reflect on the current moment? What's your experience there?
I always tell them that history is a place where you can observe a variety of different situations and learn from mistakes without experiencing any consequences of your own. So, much like Tracy, the idea of things students can tangibly touch. I would always bring classes to archives to literally touch things George Washington touched or Abraham Lincoln touched. And I think there's so much that can be garnered by that. And sometimes it's just overawing that, Abe Lincoln touched this, though they can't hold it like that. But the idea is, I think they have a chance to explore different viewpoints, different people, and get, I don't want to, some reverse pop psychology, but the idea is they get some sense of why a person did something. And especially for younger people, for teenagers, you can explore different ideas outside of your normal circle in a way that if you were to do that, let's say in your real life, maybe there are tangible issues that you're concerned about, or maybe you're shy, or maybe you don't want to face a sort of peer pressure. You have complete freedom when studying the past, and I've seen people completely change their modern viewpoints based on reading more on a historical basis for something. And I think that's good. Or if you read it and you say, you know what, my viewpoint is correct, then great. So long as people are engaging with different ideas and different perceptions, I think you can't lose, even if you completely disagree with the person.
Right, and they have to learn to stand behind what their thought process is.
Oh, exactly.
It's really nice to hear students say, I believe this because I got to read this. I think the biggest compliment is when a student comes back to me later and says, okay, so I was having this conversation in college, or my parents and I were talking at dinner and they said this, I think I'm like, and what did you find out? And they'll go and, and there's a rule in my class, you better cite 2 sources. Don't just say, well, she said, give me 2, and it cannot be social media.
Yeah, and I think that's great that I always tell students they're free to say anything they like, but they have to be able to defend it. And it can't be, well, I think. Tell me why. What is the basis for this? And I think that's a lot of it. It's provide some background, some evidence, some support for your viewpoints. And I think most people, if you are supporting a point, will listen to you. Whether they agree with you or not, that's a whole other different thing. But it lends weight to what you have to say.
And it's okay if they don't agree with you.
Yeah. Perfectly fine.
In a pluralistic society.
Exactly.
I tell my students they shouldn't agree with everything I say. And that's an important part of it, that to get an A in a class, they do not have to agree with me. They just have to make a compelling case and support it.
Yeah, and I think history books occasionally have an omniscience problem, right? Where they are the all-knowing book of everything, which I think is challenging. But I think what you guys are discussing, which I think is great, because you've come right back around to our topic, which is teaching history in tumultuous times, right? So I don't know, we're getting close to the end here, but if you all had any, I'm just trying to closing reflective thoughts on this idea. But what you're both talking about is, look, history is a way for us to understand our own collective present in whatever way that is. There's lots of different stories. I mean, an innumerable number of stories from different individuals, different people who are all experiencing these similar things. They all come together to be sort of our national story, right? And knowing that somehow makes us more comfortable, but not just knowing it, knowing the process of thinking through it somehow affords us with an ability to go out into the present and tackle whatever news headline just popped up on my phone. There's probably been 5 of them since I've been speaking with you, right? And probably each more outlandish than the last, trying to ensure that I click on them. But the idea being that, these are tools that aren't just, it's not just about knowing this stuff. There's something bigger than that. I wonder if you could both just share whatever thoughts you may have on that.
Sure, and that's big and that's broad. So we do live in a pluralistic society. There is no set national history, or if there is, it's stories of many different people. That being said, I do think there is value in certain shared ideas or basis of the government, and a basis in the ideas of the sort of founding generation. And by the founding generation, I don't mean specifically the founding fathers, quote unquote. It's anyone who helped to shape the nation. So it's a really broad and diverse story. Again, America is a country that was founded on liberty, but with obvious exceptions for African Americans, for women, for the lower classes. But it's something where liberty was expanded because of the structure of the Constitution, because of the structure of the ideas behind the nation. So obviously, to say we're in a very politically divisive moment, but there have been other politically divisive moments. 1800, 1860. These are moments that make 2019 look like nothing. A threat of potential, civil war. A president, Abraham Lincoln, winning based on the Electoral College with less than 40% of the popular vote. These are all things that have gone on before. So it's important to keep things in perspective. History books oftentimes, particularly textbooks, do sort of try to be omniscient. You also have to consider who the authors are. And I think one of the big issues for the study of history at this moment is sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional use of history as activism, as using history to convey one political side or another. And this is something that's happened throughout history from left, right, and center. But I think that's a danger when, or I shouldn't say it's a danger, but I said this is something that in a pluralistic society we have to evaluate. What's the motivation? Is the motivation to educate? Is the motivation to inform? Or is the motivation to suggest a particular point of view, whatever it is? And I think historians and those who study history need to maintain some form of objectivity. So can you have whatever political views you want? Absolutely. But it's important to evaluate people based on how they viewed that moment. What were their beliefs? What were their thoughts? Not to extrapolate what that necessarily means right now.
And I have to say that I agree with, everything he said. And I don't know what the level of difference is for being in a pluralistic classroom, or the way my classroom is set up, or how many people are in it, or the diversity or anything. In high school, for us, we walk a very fine line. So if you tiptoe any which way, you can be called down because a student has videotaped you. I would imagine it's the same thing on college level and everything too. But, and they're saying, well, this is what they said. And because of everything going on in society, as teachers, as human beings, we do have to know, the story. There is a base story, kind of, there is a baseline that we all know exists. We have to understand that baseline so that we can then say, okay, well, this is why these people thought this, and this is what they thought, exactly like he just mentioned. if I'm teaching a topic that's going to always come back to a current event and I know it, then I have to be prepared for this view on this side and this view on this side. And I have to try to get them all to come together to say, okay, well, this is why people thought that way. And you walk a fine line. And in high school, they ask all the time, well, what side are you on? Well, what do you think? Well, what is this? And you don't know if they're really curious because they want to know the past, or if they're really like, okay, I'm setting you up, so what are you going to say?
But even in among professional historians, there's oftentimes, well, what is the politics? What are the views of the person who's writing this? Because we can't properly evaluate it unless we know what side they're on. And I think that's immediately problematic. And
Right.
I often say that if I've done my job right, you shouldn't know or certainly it shouldn't matter what my politics are.
Right. And if we've done our job right too, then people should be able to walk away, either one, questioning what our politics are, or two, they should walk away knowing history as it stands and what context went into it to make us what we are. The kids, it's hard to make them understand that they're part of this story, even though it started when they weren't around. And there's not something that they can't put on a jumpsuit from that time period and be like, look, I'm here. If Bill and Ted's Adventure existed, I would be the first one to sign up for the ride.
Well, they're doing a number 3 now.
I know. But it's interesting to get it's every day for all of us, for anybody who deals with teachers, who deals with students, who deals with anybody that's like a human in the society, is to be able to see that everyone has a different view. And those of us that choose to accept all those views and move forward and understand they're coming from a place, just like from the very first question we answered, when I give both sides to my kids to argue, the goal is that they walk away too going, well, I agreed with this person, and I don't understand why you agree with this person, but you do, and that's that.
And this is not to pick on anything you said. This is me agreeing, but the idea that it's often there aren't just two sides. That's a stand-in for however many sides there are, and you could come away with some sort of amalgamation of this, and someone in whatever year you want to pick had probably a view like that as well.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're about wrapping up our time. That was a invigorating conversation. I'm sure we could continue. We had a couple more questions come in, but unfortunately we won't be able to address them at this moment. So officially, thank you so much, Dr. Craig Bruce-Smith and Tracey Downey, member of our 2019 Teacher Council, for joining us today. Kirk, did you want to say any goodbyes?
No, thank you both for joining us, and we'll be back in 2 weeks for our Halloween episode, where we're going to tell some fun narrative. We'll call them scary stories from history, but we're going to take scary as sort of a broad meaning.
And I may or may not be in historical costume.
I'm assuming you're working Salem in somewhere.
We might be. You'll have to tune in and find out.
You'll have to tune in next time. Thank you again to our delightful guests. Thank you, Kirk. And thank you to all of you watching. We'll see you soon.